Recording now.
Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. Absolutely delighted at how many people have registered and shown an interest in research in the area of spirituality and spiritual direction. So you've met Stephen. Stephen works in the SDI office and he is going to be the behind the scenes help today. So there is a chat function for those of you that maybe haven't been living on Zoom for the last few months. There is a chat function. Feel free to add any comments and Stephen will help manage that. So a couple of other people I want to introduce for this morning. I want to introduce Lynette Duncan, who you will see in the gallery. Lynette we're going to have a conversation and share about her current research. Kath Connolly and Bernie Miles are both going to present round tables after the break a little bit later. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce Reverend Seifu Singholaris, who is the Executive Director of SDI. Just before I do that, a couple of things. This is a couple of hours and Zoom can be exhausting. So please take care of yourself. Do bio breaks. Somebody introduced me the term bio break, which I liked. So if you need a bio break, if you need to go and grab, tea, coffee, water. We will be having a morning tea break for 10-15 minutes after we've had the conversation with Lynette. And this is being recorded, so this is going to be made available to the wider community for people who weren't able to make it this morning. I would like to begin by thanking the Anthony and Patrick Wright Education Fund. This would not be possible. We were in Melbourne last year where I started this program, would not be possible without their very generous funding. So I did want to begin by saying a very warm and sincere thank you to them. There may be some people here that haven't met me, don't know me. Let me give you just a brief introduction. I'm from Melbourne, but I live in Singapore and I've been in Singapore for 5 years, which is why I'm not dressed in beanies and scarves like the rest of my Southern Hemisphere friends. I've been part of SDI for a number of years now. I served on the coordinating council for 6 years, finished a couple of years ago, and since then have been working as the Asia Pacific coordinator, looking after members in the area. Part of that has been working with the Wright Foundation in putting together events, and this is the first of 4, as you're aware, 4 monthlies over the next 4 months. So that is me. I've also finished within about a month of finishing my 6 years on the coordinating council. I also finished a PhD in the area of children's spirituality through Australian Catholic Uni. So this is something very dear to my heart, as I tried for 8 years to sort of put spirituality into an academic box. So I'm very excited about what we're coming together as a community to discuss and to engage in and find new and innovative ways to get our gifts of spiritual direction and spirituality out into the world. So without further ado, let me introduce Reverend Seifu Singholaris. I'm going to spotlight you. Power you have as a host. And if you'd like to introduce yourself, Seifu, and just tell the people a little bit about yourself, and then we'll have a conversation.
Thanks, Kristen. So my name is Seifu, and I'm a Zen priest. That's my Dharma name. It means tranquil wind. I have been the executive director of SDI for just completing my 4th year now. Some 4 very exciting years. I have a varied background. I was an aspiring academic in the field of basically religious studies and philosophy for a number of years, and ended up at Microsoft because the link between academia and IT sector should be obvious. But I was an executive there for a dozen years, have been involved in the nonprofit world for now coming up on 2 decades, and joined SDI as their ED in 2016, and really with the brief to kind of expand the field, broaden the field of spiritual direction and spiritual companionship, and had the privilege of visiting Australia 3 years ago with Kristen and traveling kind of around the country and meeting many of you and many of your colleagues. Very exciting to be able to always look forward to being in Australia. So this was a wish come true on many levels. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. So, Seifu, let's begin by looking at this particular series, which began in person in August, last August in Melbourne, and continuing now online. And I just wondered if you could give us an idea of how you see this particular initiative fitting in with SDI's kind of overall vision for the world, for their work.
Yeah, I just mentioned that my brief is to really broaden the invitation to what I've been calling the spiritual direction, the spiritual companionship, public square. So to increase the range of voices that represent the authentic calling of spiritual direction. And it's in all of its distinguishing hallmarks. So the academic study of spiritual direction is one area that SDI has always been involved in through our Presence publication, which is a peer-reviewed journal that's now in its 28th, 29th year, actually. And it's one area that we've been wanting to flesh out for some time. So the confluence with the right foundation grants is that's exactly the area that they wanted to focus on as well. So this is part of SDI's efforts to really bring a range of different perspectives to spiritual direction. In this case, in particular, the academic study of spiritual direction. So it's a very nice alignment between the Right Foundation and us. And we're really hoping that all of you in Australia can help illuminate aspects of spiritual direction and spiritual companionship for the entire world. I know the focus is on Australia, but it's really lessons from Australia to the world of spiritual direction, to the broader field. So very, very happy to be here with all of you today and to participate in helping illuminate our calling.
Wonderful. And what's your hope for this particular series, the next 4 months that we'll be journeying together?
Well, I think it's really to engage in analysis. We always talk about deep listening, right? But the other aspect of that is kind of deep thinking and deep reflection on what does it mean to be a spiritual director? What does it mean to be a spiritual companion, particularly in 2020, particularly in this time of so many challenges, the various kinds of pandemics, right? The pandemic of obviously the health pandemic of COVID, but also a fear pandemic, also a wrestling with issues of privilege and racism and systemic racism around the world. So it's really kind of highlighting how important spiritual direction is, always has been, but how particularly important it is in 2020 and the times that we're living in right now. So my hope with these symposia, with the four of the series of 4 of them, is that we will all together, you will all together help illuminate just how vibrant and relevant this field is in tackling so many of the challenges that are before us.
Yeah, and speaking of COVID, I think that the word of the year has been pivot. I've heard that a lot with people pivoting and companies pivoting, and I'm just wondering, how has SDI kind of pivoted? How have they responded to some of the challenges where we are isolated? And so as spiritual directors who love connection, and suddenly we find ourselves disconnected, how has SDI responded?
Well, you know, it's interesting because we do love connection, but we also love contemplation, right? And being stuck at home or in our various communities does give ample room for reflection and meditation and prayer and discernment. Um, and it builds also these Zoom engagements build a different kind of intimacy and a much broader intimacy in some ways. You know, we had this big conference planned in Santa Fe, New Mexico, 2, 3 months ago, which we had to postpone by a year. And in its place, what we've done is just a series of town halls, digital town halls. We've increased our webinar offerings and other online offerings considerably. And it's been wonderful to see just the hundreds, thousands of people collectively across all of those events that have been able to gather together. And so this digital medium, which has its limitations, also allows for a degree of communication and interaction that wasn't possible before. And so it's been kind of a wonderful thing to, as so many of us have discovered just how powerful this connection can be, this technology can be for connection, that our community is getting broader and that in some ways we're able to connect, even though there's no substitute for face-to-face communication. But some of us are able to connect across the world, across different geographies and time zones with real intimacy. So it's that's been a blessing, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I thought this might be a really good opportunity to announce the next initiative that we are part of. And again, thanks to the generous support of the Wright Foundation, we were able to secure a second round of funding. And that has enabled us to put together 2 handbooks. So I sort of, I spoke a little bit about it in the newsletter if you're on the Asia Pac newsletter recipient list. So here is what we are hoping is to produce 2 handbooks. The first handbook will be looking at how spiritual direction, the role spiritual direction and spirituality plays in the current world. Where are the growing edges? Where are the invitations? Where are those new places where spiritual direction can really be helpful and transforming in the world? We're going to put that together with an essay competition. So we're inviting submissions. There is actually a cash prize. We've got 3 prizes for the first 3 papers. We're looking for articles of around 5,000 to 6,000 words each. They do need to be within an Australian context because the funding is an Australian grant. We're looking at, so welcome if you're outside Australia to submit, but it does need to have an Australian flavour or Australian context. And we're giving people plenty of time. So we're opening it up today, but we're giving people until the end of January. So if you're one of those people that likes to leave things to the last minute and their summer holidays, you will have a good sort of about 6 months. And we're going to put that together in the form of a handbook, which will be published by SDI and looking to publish that next year. And as Seifu mentioned before, really our hope is that the rest of the world can learn from what we are doing. There are things that we do in Australia, New Zealand, the Asia Pacific area that are really innovative, and they often don't get known about. So our hope is that we take some of our wisdom, some of our initiatives, and we give those, spread those to the larger spiritual direction community. So that's the first handbook. The second handbook is I'm particularly excited about, when you end up writing the book that you wish you had. I wish someone had given me this book when I started my PhD. I want to put together a handbook on research approaches and methodologies for research in the area of spirituality and spiritual direction. Now, again, we're asking for submissions if you've done some research and used an innovative approach. What I'm hoping to do is to highlight somewhere between maybe 15 to 20 different approaches and methodologies, things that maybe we haven't considered in this for research in this area. You know, new ideas. I've come across I've had some amazing conversations in the last week or so with some people, and, you know, all sorts of interesting things that I hadn't heard of before. One was called alchemic hermeneutics, researcher, the wounded researcher, which I need to go and explore a little bit more. So just some really interesting approaches. So that will be, we'll be putting that together very, it doesn't have to be 5,000 or 6,000 words. They can just be, it might be in the form of a case study. It might be in the form of an interview or a paper that you want to write. So feel very free to reach out to me if you've got some insights. And we're hoping to have both of those handbooks published with SDI next year. Just on that, the next research symposium we have planned for the 20th of August will have a real focus on publishing. So I've got 3 published authors, David Tacey, Irene Alexander, and Peter Adams, who are going to share their journey, their recently published books in the area of spirituality and spiritual direction. And there'll be times and opportunities to ask questions about, you know, how they got published, and looking at, I probably need to spotlight myself, don't I? Yeah, so there'll be opportunities to ask questions and get some insights. And just on that, I might just ask, come back to Seifu, because Seifu, if you just want to, SDI has recently relaunched SDI Print. And so I just want to hand to you, and you can talk about opportunities for researchers in this part of the world who might like to publish their book, their manuscript.
Yeah, so thank you, Kristen. So yes, we did launch, actually, SDI Press, we're calling it, last year with a book on narrative storytelling by Diane Millis, and then a couple of months ago, a book on spiritual direction supervision from Lucy Abbott Tucker. And we have several more books in the pipeline. There's a process to submit manuscripts for SDI to consider them, and it's on our website, sdicompanions.org. You can find more information on submission guidelines there. Obviously, we're interested in spiritual direction, so the focus of whatever writing has to be spiritual direction or spiritual companionship. But we're looking at a variety of different takes and perspectives on the field, on the calling, and very excited. I mean, the first 2 books have done extremely well. I think most of you know Lucy Abbott Tucker, and that supervision manual primer has done exceedingly well, and so we're very excited about it. And we welcome all of you who might want to have your manuscripts considered to submit them to us.
Wonderful. And there are some other publishing opportunities, not necessarily within the academic field, but certainly within the spiritual direction field. And Stephen probably is the best person to give us an overview of that as the content coordinator. Now, Stephen, I can't find you. Can you start talking so I can spot?
I can start talking. As Seifu can tell you, that's something I'm never at a loss for. Your question was, what are we looking for when it comes to what the stories that we put in our on our website? I love practical wisdom. Anybody, I don't know, raise your hand if you like practical wisdom. I'm talking about something that allows you to connect spiritually that you can immediately try, you can apply. It could be a practice, it could be a poem, it could be a way of observing silence or welcoming stillness. I love anything about that. I love anything that focuses on spiritual companionship, particularly from the provider's standpoint. And if I seem distracted a little bit, it's because more people are flowing into our meeting. So clearly you've all made a good choice because there are lots of people following you here. Well, when I say the practice of spiritual companionship, I'm talking about notes, especially first-person stories about what you tried that failed, what you tried that worked, what your experience was, because I think that often it's our experiences that are the best learning tools and teaching tools. So anything you can share from the heart about what's worked and what hasn't is always valuable. Just so that you know, we're around 7,000, maybe a little bit less, members in SDI in 42 countries around the world. And most of those members are spiritual directors or spiritual companions. Now, spiritual companion is a little wider descriptor, but all of them focus on the deep listening, the respect for the agency of the other, and some sense of contemplative practice. Doesn't have to be prayer or meditation or anything in particular. You might dance and that might be your contemplative practice. But those aspects, if you're doing something that companions people in that way, I'd love to hear from you. And I'm going to I've already put the link in if you haven't already registered for the second one. I'm excited, I'm registering for it. That's the one I'm publishing. And I'm gonna put in my email and also something that takes you right to our SDI SDI Stories of Companionship, which is on our website, so that you can check it out and then just send me an email with an idea, and I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, Kristen.
Wonderful. Thanks, Stephen. So we've got a few moments. If anyone has any questions that they would like to ask of either Stephen or myself or Seifu, anything that they're curious about, how SDI's responding to things, or then feel free to pop anything in, any questions you have or comments into the chat. This is wonderful. We're up to 78 people, which is just a wonderful response. So just while I'm, oh, okay. So Lynn's just asked if there's an overall topic for the publication. So with the handbook, were you referring to, Lynn? With the handbook is not really specifically, well, the topic will be new directions, new areas. So very much looking at, it might be interfaith, it could be an Indigenous focus, it could be children, families, it could be LGBTIQ plus communities, it could be homeless. Just looking at how we can possibly take the gift of spiritual direction, spiritual companioning into the world, into different areas that maybe we haven't considered before. So it's pretty broad. I'm trying to keep it kind of fairly broad so that we can hear as many voices and include as many different possibilities as we can. Oh, welcome. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, Stephen and Seifu will be around for the next little while. So if anything pops up, Stephen will be there to answer any questions. Sylvia's just asked how we contact. So maybe Stephen, if you want to pop your email address in, you can pop mine in as well. Anyone's got any questions about the handbooks, then they can certainly contact you. Stephen's very responsive. You will get a response back if you email Stephen. I
actually have a question for you, Kristen.
Yes.
Could you just talk a little bit about the session, the Symposium 3 and 4, just in a brief way, so they get a sense of you talked about the publishing?
Yeah, sure. So the third one, what I'm looking at doing is holding a 3-minute thesis, a 3MT competition. So my hope for that was to include as many voices of people doing research in spirituality and spiritual companioning and direction in Australia and in the area. So it'll be you get 3 minutes to present your research, and it's deliberate. It's deliberately short so that you need to synthesize and be really succinct about what you're studying and researching. And we've also got some prizes. So I've already got a couple of people registered. Now, this isn't just for PhD, but also for masters, postgrad, and I can even envisage people doing formation programs that, as part of their formation program requirements, they're required to submit articles and essays, anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000, depending on their program. So hoping people like, who are thinking about their topics to be able to present. And it's just a wonderful way for people to see where the thinking is, where people engaged, what questions, are coming up for the spiritual directors and spiritual companionings. That's the focus of the third one. We'll also have some round tables. So if anyone is out there and they would like to present a little bit longer, 3 minutes might be a little bit short for some people. If you've got something that you'd like to present more around 20, 25 minutes, we still have some slots available for August and September and October, with a plan of having 3. But if we get lots, we can do breakout rooms and have some more. That's the focus of the third one. And then the last one will be looking at research methodologies. So again, there'll be keynote, hopefully I'll get a keynote speaker. There'll be some roundtables as well. And then also I'm going to try to put together a panel with some key people and just looking at some of the innovative approaches. So someone asked a question about the competition. Yes, so the essay competition is focused mainly on that first handbook, Spiritual Direction Without Borders, but we've got a little bit of funds to play with. So if you did want to submit something that was specific for the second handbook, for the research methodologies, if we get quite a few people, then yes, we can absolutely look at kind of awarding prizes. I just wasn't sure, because there's there might be much more of a range of length and how people present that. So it was a little bit harder to make that competition as such. But yeah, so the first one will be looking at that 5,000 to 6,000 words limit for the essay for the first handbook. Any other questions? So that's kind of how I see the next few. Hopefully there is plenty of room for you to participate. I'd love to see some people presenting roundtables. I'd love some more 3-minute thesis competitions entrance. So if you are part of a formation program, please feel free to invite your students who are looking at and encourage them to present. It's actually a really helpful process. I did it when I was doing my thesis as well. It really does force you into being really clear and succinct about what what you're hoping to do with the research. So, as I mentioned, Stephen and Seifu are going to be around, so feel free to fire any questions at them. What I would like to do now is to move to the next part of this symposium and invite Lynette Duncan. So Lynette Duncan and I have known each other for a very long time. And Lynette started her PhD a little bit after mine, but I've always been quite fascinated with her topic and her approaches. So I thought we might move into a conversation, Lynette, between you and I about your research, about and because you've got some kind of interesting approaches and some methodologies that you've come across. So let me introduce Lynette Duncan, Spiritual Director from Melbourne. Would you like to introduce, just give a little bit more you're a Uniting Church minister, you work at Wellspring, just feel free to share a little bit about who you are, Lynette.
Well, yes, formator at Wellspring Ecumenical Spirituality Centre. and also a United Church minister, and also a perpetual student doing my PhD, and also a supervisor. And supervision is the thing that's really caught my passion as, in my research and also growing practice.
Wonderful. I was just thinking about something you mentioned to me a little while ago. You did some supervision training with a group that weren't specifically spiritual directors, were they? You entered a program with other modalities. There were psychologists and psychotherapists. And I remember you saying that how good it was to see spiritual direction in that environment as a modality, and really how helpful and, you know, how special and kind of unique it was compared to some of the other modalities.
Yes, I remember people observing my practice as a supervisor and saying, tell us how you do that. And I said, well, I listen contemplatively. And it's almost like it was a new thing, and yet they could see the fruit of it in what the questions and what was happening for the person being supervised. So there was a lot of positive affirmation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. So tell me about your research. What was the question that led you to a PhD?
Well, I think it actually wasn't so much a question as an experience, which is good for us spiritual directors. But some of the impetus to do this was from attending a workshop with Margaret Benefiel and Geraldine Holton at Spiritual Directors International Conference in Atlanta. And the workshop was called Wisdom's Garden. And it was a contemplative supervision approach that they modelled and we experienced, that I felt very at home in, but particularly with the amount of silence that was part of the supervision. So that was one of the prompts to say, I really want to take what I already do as a spiritual director, but explore this with supervision. So my research is investigating supervision with a contemplative stance through a collaborative inquiry, and that's my research topic. So supervision with a contemplative stance, a collaborative inquiry. And I'm doing it at a public university, La Trobe University, in the Department of Psychology and Public Health, which is quite surprising too. But particularly what's happened in the way it's all come about is looking at this as a kind of a public health response, how we might supervise practical wisdom, as Stephen said, to actually help people in their health and well-being. Yeah. So I guess I can keep chatting. Just tell me.
Keep going.
But I want to explore the understanding and experience of participant spiritual care supervisors from different spiritual care and allied health settings. So I've interviewed participant spiritual care supervisors, people who supervise others in spiritual care, from pastoral theology backgrounds, spiritual direction, therapy, creative arts and counselling, clinical pastoral education, and hospital spiritual care chaplains. So there's some of the settings of my participants, looking at what a contemplative stance offers in their supervision practice.
So not just spiritual direction and spiritual companions. When you say spiritual care, is that a term that, how do you understand that term? Is that just a broad...
Well, it's helpful in research because spiritual care is, well, it's a real burgeoning field in the last few years, but it kind of is a way of saying it's a kind of a wider arena in a way, but it's about how people acknowledge the spiritual in whatever their practice is. So in spiritual care, traditionally it can be chaplaincy, ministry, spiritual direction is included, but it's a way of attending to people in a spiritual care way. So, but you can include a lot under spiritual care, including spiritual direction. So it's how we actually offer care and companionship to people that acknowledges and sanctions the spiritual. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So how have you approached your research? I know you did some interviews. What sort of What?
Look, there's been a couple of tiers to it. I really appreciate my supervisors at the university who have an enormous capacity and also were able to listen to my topic and what I wanted to do. And so they invited me to do interviews with the participants, selective interviews, but they called it selective interviews with emergent conversations. So they saw the researchers allowing a conversation that was emergent, not just being tied to the research questions, but just having a kind of relaxed conversation, much like in supervision. So it was a way of modelling some of what I was researching in the way it went about. And then receiving back the information and a couple of repeated phrases, going back and forth with the transcripts, asking questions, and then actually looking at the methodology, which I'll talk about in a minute. But my research questions were largely, what do spiritual care supervisors understand of a contemplative stance in supervision? What is the experience of a contemplative stance for spiritual care supervisors? And what are the effects of a contemplative stance for spiritual care supervisors? So I think there's certainly some crossover with spiritual direction because it's looking at what is kind of the efficacy of a contemplative stance. What is it about a contemplative stance that is important for them? Yeah. And leading to practical wisdom, taking Stephen's point, how does that actually affect their practice and flow and effect into the world?
So you used the word collaborative. Was it a collaborative approach? Collaborative?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yes. Well, the collaborative is, again, one of the things about my research methodology, I guess I can go into that too, is that it actually talks about a participatory approach and collaborative in that it views the fact the research is not separated from the actual, you're a participant in the research, as is everyone. And that all knowledge is in a way is participatory. We participate in what we're actually researching. So the collaborative nature was it that I wasn't the expert coming in, but actually engaging with peers and collaborating and listening and going back and forth with what their wisdom was to actually share the wisdom. So it's very much about relationships and about collaborating together and not hierarchical in that sense. But I, as the researcher, do a lot of the actual writing, but there's a sense of we're in it together. So that's part of it. I can talk more about the actual methodology. John Heron and Peter Reason have put together this thing called the participatory inquiry paradigm, and it believes that to experience anything is to participate in it. And to participate in it is to mould and encounter the knowledge. And so it's subjective and objective, and it's relative to the knower. I hope that's not too technical for people, but there's a sense of it being very much a strong emphasis on the researcher as being a co-researcher. So I hope that kind of makes sense. Yeah.
It's a really good point, and it's something that I felt like I had to fight against when I was doing mine. I felt like it took me months to even put my research thesis in the first person. They wanted me to write it in the third person. And I think this is a really key factor in when we're researching in spirituality and spiritual direction. We are part of the research. We are being transformed in the process. And our voice is as important as the participants. And I think one of the things, just in my very brief look at some of the methodologies, is that's the desire, I think, for a lot of methodologies, is how do we put ourselves as researcher into the research and form part of that shared understanding of what a right. Yeah.
Very much so. And I think for me, that's made it delightful in terms of compatibility with my topic, that, to me, a contemplative stance and supervision are both modelling a kind of a partnering togetherness, interrelationship. And the thing about the participatory inquiry is really important because it actually talks about our relationships, not just with each other, but also with the cosmos. So it's a kind of ever-expanding wide web of relationships. So this particular methodology is very holistic, and it connects with a lot of the holistic understanding of spiritual care, that we're not we're not mind over matter, we're actually connecting, you know, all of that together and all our different relationships. So that's been really, really helpful. I'm lucky that I have supervisors who kind of alerted me that such a research methodology existed.
Yeah, yeah. So what does it mean at a practical level? It means that you've undertaken interviews. How do you then, you mentioned about some phrases, some common phrases that came up. How do you go through that process? Analyze the
Well,
data?
yeah, the process actually has started with the interviews, then the transcripts, and then coming back to the transcripts, there's been a kind of a data analysis phase, and I'll talk about that as well. And that's been really good too. I was, years and years ago, when my supervisor mentioned Carol Gilligan, I'd read her book in a different voice, Psychological Theory on a Women's Development, and loved it, you know, back in, I don't know when it was, might have been the 80s or 90s. But anyway, I loved that. And she said that there was this methodology called On the Listening Guide by Carol Gilligan and Spencer and Weinberg. And the listening guide is a voice-centered relational method, again, paralleling some of the research. But it actually talks about taking what you've received and having a series of sequential listenings, which again really fits spiritual direction well. But you keep listening to different ways of looking at the data and what's you've been fed back. And the first phase is you actually devise poems called I-we poems. You take every statement that is an I statement. Whenever anyone says I do something, and there's a lot of I statements in the feedback, I feel, I think, I center, I meditate, all of those things are in the research. And also any we statements, we share, we collaborate, we, you know, all of those kind of things. And you make a poem from each person's feedback, and then that's the first phase. And look what emerges in terms of patterns. And that particular listening is meant to look at the kind of cadence of a person's speech, the kind of flow, the repetitions, and tell you something about what they're emphasising. So that's an interesting part of the first part. The second listening is called listening to the plot. And looking at the transcripts in terms of the how, where, settings, why, what's not being said. And it's a bit like a narrative way of looking at them. So you've got your first listening, see what emerges. Your second listening to the plot of the person's transcript and the story being told, how they begin, how they end. And the last part is the part I think you mentioned earlier, listening to what they call, it's a difficult word, contrapuntal voices. And I had to look it up myself to find out what it meant. But contrapuntal voices are two or more things said at the same time. It might be in opposition, but it can also be in harmony. And I'll give an example. I supervise, yet I also consult. A contemplative stance is optional, yet I find I couldn't not have that in my practice. So you see, you're saying two things, but you're saying them kind of, you know, together, and to explore what that's saying in the research. So if you can hear each of these different listenings, and then at the end, step 4, you actually summarise it all and connect it all together. So you look at the interrelationship of all that's emerged. So it's been fantastic, almost too much information because there's so much come out. And as a spiritual director, I'm getting animated a bit. What I find really helpful in this approach is that it actually is a bit like spiritual direction, where there's always more, and there's a lot of, you know, nuances and things that you hadn't noticed before, and kind of ways of looking at the data that emerge. So yeah, I found it really helpful, and it's looking at the different voices, and it's relational too. So
yeah, Catherine just made a comment about listening to a Bach fugue is a great way. And Bach is the master of counterpoint and contrapuntal. I looked at this particular approach when I looked at my research with young children, and got very excited about it, as you can imagine. because I was videotaping young children at play in an outdoor environment and taking little snippets of conversation and play episodes. And so when I sat down and did the poems, I mean, it was just beautiful. There were, you know, voices of 3- and 4-year-olds. You know, I play, I see, I listen, I feel. In the end, I wasn't quite able to convince my non-spiritual supervisor that it would have been an appropriate methodology, but there is part of me that would love to go back and pull out my data and look at it through that lens, because I think it does offer a really unique way of looking at people's perception of the world. And that, when you mentioned the I and the we, how they see themselves as individual versus community, and how they identify within a bigger community. So we'll put some links in the chat in the break, because I'm sure there'll be people that are want to hear a little bit more about Carol Gilligan's work, and the other person you mentioned about the participatory research. So we'll pop a few links in there so we can make sure that we do that. What else, Lynette? What else happened? What was the next part?
Well, I guess I'm in, I think it's the downhill phase, but I'm in the writing up of the findings and the discussion chapter and toing and froing a bit between them, and then I'll just have to do some concluding comments in the conclusion. But because it's about emergent research and the whole thing about a contemplative stance, what I suspected at the beginning, it wasn't going to be one thing. It was more going to be what kind of is hinted at from this that will offer practical wisdom to other fields. I'm just here seeing a question there. How large? Because it's qualitative inquiry, you can have a relatively small sample. I had 10 people that I interviewed. I think with the amount of information back and the research, that was manageable and seems to be quite okay in a participatory inquiry. So yeah, 10 people is my sample. You could have more, you could have, I think you can even have a little bit less. I think my supervisor said 8 was probably the minimum. But I had 10 particular people that I interviewed at depth. And I didn't say that before. I had 10 interview questions, and you know, some of the transcripts were about 11 pages that I got back. Some were slightly shorter, and I had 3 research questions.
Yeah, you end up with a lot of data, don't you?
Yeah. So it's their, the main thing is it's their understanding and their experience for contemplative stance. So that's kind of where we're at there. I think the thing that's been really exciting about it, I didn't say this earlier too, is one of the things about the participatory perspective is they also allow for mystery and limits to people's knowledge. And I really wanted a research perspective that allowed that, because I knew that a contemplative stance wasn't about containing the knowledge so that there wasn't an openness. And one of the things that's come out for me is that a lot of people who've talked about a contemplative stance have talked about engaging with mystery or limits. And I think that's important, that when you're researching something, you can also talk about what can't be known or what's, you know, beyond your horizon and all of that, particularly in terms of the way a contemplative stance invites us to that more or mystery. So that's been really helpful too. Yeah.
Well, that's good. One of the things I'm curious about is what's it like having a spiritual director as the interviewer? Because it's not I mean, obviously, you know, you're bringing the skills as an interviewer, but you're also bringing yourself as a spiritual director, and that search for what's the deeper meaning, what's sitting under what the words are. And I'm wondering what that experience was like for you, or whether there's something unique about our, you know, spiritual directors as researchers.
I think there was a couple of experiences for me in the interview and the research that were surprising in terms of what I was listening for. I think as spiritual directors, we're often listening for, well, at a whole lot of different levels. But a couple of people I noticed in my inner being that I felt very warm at certain times and very connected with. And I found myself saying, you know, oh, that really resonates with me. I'd never met the person, but there was something about a connection beyond the words. So I was aware of the resonance that happens without speaking. I was also aware, as a spiritual director coming into it, I was very interested, and I haven't actually mentioned this in what I'm writing up, but the times there were pauses, and really honouring those pauses, whereas perhaps some researchers who weren't spiritual directors might not. So when there was a pause, just holding that space and knowing that that was significant. And I think in every case there was a pause moment, which was great, and it was good. It was a kind of not needing to rush what happened, but just holding and being with what was I was hearing. So I think as spiritual directors, we're often affected by what we're hearing, and we're listening differently. Yeah.
Thank you. So I've got some, we've got some comments coming in, and feel free to ask. We can, Lynette's here for a little bit longer, so we don't have too many questions. Anything else you wanted to add that we didn't get to, or?
Yeah, I think just very quickly, I think one of the things that you offered when we were first going to have this dialogue was about challenges. I think some of the challenges I faced is it is hard to be fully collaborative, and the COVID-19 situation has affected that. Some people are not able to be as collaborative at this time because they are holding a lot in their own practice and lives. And I think also needing to take time off. It's been a long journey as a part-time student, and twice having to kind of extend the time and fill in forms. I don't like filling in forms. I can name that quite quickly, but, you know, universities and many institutions are very good at forms. So I had to fill in a couple of forms at various times that were tedious. And I think, yeah, there's been supervisors. Everyone I speak to in their research often has issues with supervisors. Mine are great, but they swapped around. The primary and the secondary one swapped at one stage. So all of those things just to be aware of in your research process, that life and situations can affect what you do, and it's all been okay, but just be prepared for that it's never going to be it's a smooth journey. There's lots of kind of twists and turns. Yeah.
Yes, there are. It's far from a smooth journey. So I've got some really good questions coming in. Someone asked, where are we? Leonie asked about one of the challenge is defining spirituality, also practical application. And I think that really is at the heart of what we're trying to do. I went more for like a description rather than a definition. I felt that, and I used Goodliff. 2012, I came across who had a model for, it was a 4-quadrant circle, and it looked at spirituality through the lens of, this was particularly relevant for children, but through the lens of awe and wonder, mystery and transcendence, relational, reflection, and creativity and imagination. So I found that really helpful. For me, that gave me a much broader lens in which I could kind of describe and not try and kind of limit spirituality. But how did you go about that challenge?
I think everyone will say, and I think when you hear David Tacey in the publishing, that spirituality, to define it in a bit like contemplative, in a closed sense, is impossible. But people will have different ways of defining it by its characteristics, and some are more, you know, you'll probably find you're attracted to different definitions. I quite liked one by Pukowski, Christina, I think is her name. She works in the health field, and that's kind of some of my setting in terms of where I'm speaking into. And she writes a really good definition of spirituality in an article. I'm happy to give the reference for that for people. And also, I think in theology circles, there's different people too. I'm going mentally blank on one at the moment. But I think you'll find different definitions. And I think if you're researching, this is to anyone, look at the one that connects with what you're feeling you want to say. But I guess my invitation would be to find one that's relatively comprehensive in these days and times, and not just confined to a particular denomination or a worldview that's, yeah, I think we need to look for spirituality. It's a very broad concept. It's people's essence and their values and their meaning, and things around that have those kind of parameters or openness. Yeah, I notice I'm using my hands. So for me, whatever definition you choose, it needs to have an openness to it. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. You don't want to be limited with that. It'll just keep limiting you through the process. There was another question. Leonie wanted to know, is a pause and silence to do with reading the demeanour of participants? So I think she's just wondering about how that silence and those pauses kind of came about in your interviews.
Well, I guess a bit like a spiritual direction, they tended to be a bit spontaneous. And that's what I really appreciated, that the pauses happened as I offered a question or a memory was triggered for someone, and they just immediately paused and went into a kind of a way of accessing something without words. And that's what I really liked. So the pauses came at different places for each person. Yeah, which again, that to me was quite in synchronicity with spiritual direction. It just happened. There wasn't a let's have a pause now. It just happened. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Lynn wanted to know, do you have any sense of where your paper will land in terms of your original thesis questions? This is always a really interesting one. Is the thesis you end up with the one you intended to write?
I don't know exactly where it will land. I have had articles published in the journal Practical Theology, and I've also had an article published in an international journal on supervision. Reflective practice, ministry supervision. So those fields are very open. In terms of healthcare, that will be interesting to see where that lands. There aren't many spiritual care journals or spirituality journals per se. That would certainly be a place I could put some of what where it'll land. My supervisors seem to think it'll probably be a book that I published because there's so much information. And in that sense, I don't know where that will land. But I'm hoping, and I'm actually conscious of our context, COVID-19 at the moment, that I think the world is yearning for a contemplative way, and in a strange way, the slowing down that's had to happen has, for many people, had them, contemplating what's really valuable and meaningful for them. And it's all about spirituality and, the deeper kind of things of life. So my sense is that I'll probably be speaking into something that's quite timely. And the other thing that I've already found is that the clinical supervision realm, which isn't my realm, have been quite interested. I was meant to be presenting a paper at a Clinical Supervision Australia National Conference this year, but of course cancelled. And they've said, yes, could I come back next year? But I'm coming in from a different kind of field, and they're very interested in what contemplative stances might offer in their field, which is, again, in the medical, the clinical, it's very outcome and evidence-based. And they're saying, no, there's something we are interested in about contemplative space, which is more open, and practices which we haven't incorporated in the past.
It's exciting, isn't it, that there's interest?
Yeah. So I don't know where it will land. I'm kind of open to see that, but I obviously spiritual direction is still very close to my heart, and so that will continue. But there may be other fields and other dialogues yet to happen.
Mm-hmm. Great. Kathy was interested in, I'm wondering what methods Lynette put in place to be transparent about her own participation and acknowledge this in the final write-up. That's a really good question.
Yeah. That's a good point. I've certainly been able to name some of my bias in some of what I'm writing. And I did notice that in the writing, there's been quite a lot of mention of spiritual direction, which I didn't mention, but other people did. And I wondered if it's because they Googled me online beforehand, or, some of the people know me from other contexts. So that was interesting. And I'll speak with my supervisor how I named that. So in that sense, I've also named, to begin the thesis, my experience from that workshop in SDI, and I've said where it was and what my experience was of a contemplative stance and how that sparked the research. So I've been able to name that right at the beginning, and that's one of the reasons that I'm looking at this topic from an experiential point of view. So some of that is there. I guess I'll get some advice from my supervisors on how I name the experience of it. But yeah, I think the method will be just to name myself as researcher and my own experience.
Yeah, and I think it's probably been like a barrier in the past that I think we need to find ways around.
Perhaps this is a word to prospective researchers. Really good to get good supervisors. And the supervisors I've got are very open to the I in research, the personal, the subjective. One of them is both a brilliant editor and has had lots of different roles, but they also work in the arts therapy field. So they're very attuned to creative and presentational, representational ways and poetry and artistic ways. So in that sense, they're very open to subjective knowing, and I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, hugely helpful. Someone asked, would you be open to putting your email address in the chat? Are you open for people to email you or contact you if they've got questions about your specific?
My dilemma at the moment, and this sounds terrible from many points of view, but I'm probably too busy to respond with some of all the things I'm doing this last year. This is my final year, and I have to write it up this year. Next year I'd say yes, but at the moment I don't think I'd be open to email responding to people, but I'd certainly be open to perhaps if you want to send some questions to Kristen or to SDI and they can relay them, that might be easier that way. It's just the immediate stuff I would probably feel that I can't quickly respond to. Yeah.
No, totally understand. That's fine. And someone asked for a couple of references, so maybe in the break you and I can pop down.
Look, I think what I'll do is I'll put them in the chat. I'll just type away if that's all right, because that would be the easier way for me to do it.
Yep, that'd be wonderful. Thank you so much, Lynette. It's so interesting when you're getting an insight into how people have put together their research and where they started and the methods that they use. So I'm so grateful for your generous sharing of your process, particularly in the busy year of trying to write it up. So thank you so much, and I'm sure on behalf of us all, we just want to say thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Kristen. Take care.
Welcome. Thank you. So I think it's time for a break. That's been a lot of information and a lot of sharing. It is 9:04 Singapore time, so it's 04 somewhere in the world where you are. So let us take, let's take 15 minutes. So let's come back at 20 past the hour. Go grab yourself, go for a walk, grab some fresh air. And we've got I'm very much looking forward to two beautiful presentations coming up, one by Bernie Miles and one by Kath Connolly. So don't miss them. Don't go away and forget to come back. And we'll have some time as well to explore their topics and ask questions. So let's take a break, 15 minutes, and be back at 20 past the hour. Are you ready? Can you start talking so that I can find you?
Yes, here I am.
There you are, wonderful. No, still can't find you. Hang on. Oh, I've got to take myself off the tape. Okay.
Okay, can you See me now?
Okay, let me spotlight you. I'm find my thing at the top. Sorry, just give me 1 second. I will let you introduce yourself, Bernie, for those of us who don't know you. But I would very much like to welcome. I'm seeing your screen. I'll just do that again. Sorry. For some reason, Rosalie's screen and not you. Just see if I can come back to me. Stephen, do you know why that's happening?
Yes. Roselle, you're sharing your screen, and it's a fascinating shot of a rose. And we love all your folders. They're very neatly aligned, but we'd like to get on with the show. If you can stop sharing, that would be wonderful.
Okay, Rosalie, are you there?
She may not know what she's doing.
I wonder how we do we have control over?
Yeah, I'm trying to.
Sorry, Bernie, just give us 1 second.
That's okay.
Technical glitches.
Sorry, folks. Were I better, I would be able to control this, but oh, here we go. Found the right button.
Ah, beautiful. All right, I am going to go back to Bernie.
I knew there was a purpose I was here.
Yeah, definitely. More than one, Stephen. More than one. All right. Sorry, Bernie. Over to you if you'd like to introduce yourself, and welcome, and thank you so much for being here and participating in the Research Symposium.
Thank you. It's really good to be here. My name's Bernie Miles, as you can see. I'm co-director of Cardia Formation, which is based in Mulgrave at Stirling Theological College with Marlene Marburg. We've been there now for about Cardia's been going for 5 years. I'm a researcher, I'm a spiritual director, a formator of spiritual directors, wife, mother, grandmother, jack of all trades, really. I'm really passionate about the possibilities that spiritual direction can bring into the world, particularly in this 21st century when everything's just kind of up in the air. But it was interesting to hear Lynette say that her original research was sparked from the SDI conference a few years ago. And my original research, which was to explore how spiritual direction can support leadership and organisational development, was also sparked at an SDI conference in 2010, when Brian Swim stood up and gave us some wonderful presentations and challenged spiritual directors to lead organisations into the future, to be listening deeply to how we're going to be shaped in the future. And never has there been more a time when what we will look like is so uncertain. So spiritual direction is about listening at that deeper level. But today's presentation is an introduction to Cardia Formation's current research project, which seeks to explore how spiritual direction can support and enhance teacher identity and well-being, leading to a deepening of vocation and capacity for longevity in the profession. The researchers involved in this project include Dr. Marlene Marburg, who has a background in secondary education, is a poet, a spiritual director, a formator of and supervisor of spiritual directors, and as I said, co-director at Cardia Formation. Dr. Julie Mitchell, who's formed as a spiritual director in the Ignatian tradition and has worked as a secondary teacher in Victorian schools, is a curriculum writer and consultant nationally, and a secondary teacher, and a teacher educator at Melbourne University. So we've got really good links into the educational system. And then I'm the primary researcher, where I have a background in business management, spiritual director, formator, and supervisor. And I'm currently a honorary postdoctoral researcher with the University of Divinity at Stirling Theological College. So as I said, this research project follows on from my PhD research, where I examined the capacity of spiritual direction to support leadership and organisational development. The PhD research revealed the following conclusion. Leaders and organisations willing to be transformed through spiritual direction will progressively raise leadership and organisational consciousness. Raising consciousness clarifies who you are, what you stand for, and focuses energy towards a common purpose. Spiritual direction can help build awareness of the primary spirit of individuals and groups so they can identify alignment and misalignment in their shared identity and purpose, releasing energy and creativity into leadership and organisational development. In Christian language, I would say that the most surprising result of the research for me was to be able to say with conviction and clarity that spiritual direction supports leaders and organisations to strengthen their relationship with God, and in doing so, work towards becoming Christ for the world today. To be Christ is to be free from enslavement of fear and limited perceptions of the self, and then to use that freedom at the service of all creation. I ended the PhD research with the conviction that fostering a relationship with God or source or mystery or whatever language you use to name your experience of interconnectedness with all of creation is a rich and vital untapped resource for leadership and organisational development. The research findings also identified an opportunity to develop formation programs that specialise in forming spiritual directors to work in the area of leadership and organisational development, enlarging the framework for spiritual direction to integrate concepts of leadership and organisational development. There is an emerging opportunity for spiritual direction to enter the workplace where a formally appointed spiritual director cares for the spiritual needs of an organisation. When an organisation places a spiritual director in a formal professional role, the most vulnerable aspects of the organisation are given a voice. Designing formation programs to support the integration of business disciplines and spiritual direction will reshape the face of spiritual direction and at the same time develop new awareness of the capacity of spiritual direction to support the corporate world. This current research seeks to understand what the Ministry of Spiritual Direction can offer the field of education by providing professional support through spiritual direction to teachers and educational leaders. Teacher education courses focus largely on curriculum, content, and pedagogical knowledge and skills. The greatest resource in the cultivation of well-being and enhanced learning outcomes for students is the teacher's self and is given minimal attention. Yet we teach who we are, for better or worse. The complexity of the work of teachers continues to grow. Teachers carry high expectations from their school leaders, parents, their students, the wider community, and themselves. They carry heavy, demanding workloads, and in such a climate, it is easy to see how, without a robust sense of vocation and the nurturing of this, teachers suffer from high stress, become disillusioned and disconnected. Current research shows these factors contribute to high attrition rates, particularly of early career teachers. Spiritual direction is a practice that enables a person to be connected to their authentic self, which can, in turn, foster and strengthen a sense of purpose and vocation. This project seeks to explore how spiritual direction can support and enhance teacher identity and well-being, leading to a deepening of vocation and capacity for longevity in the profession. The research project has 3 stages. Stage 1, we're engaging with a school who has employed a spiritual director for the past 5 years. We'll carry out an in-depth role analysis with that spiritual director with a view to understanding any complexities and challenges for the role of a spiritual director in schools. Teachers who have received spiritual direction from this director in their school context will be interviewed, and the data collected will be a guide to establish the criteria for stage 2 of our research. Stage 2 will be the preparation of spiritual directors for stage 3 and will involve formation in the areas of organisational role analysis, systems theory and leadership theory. We will draw on learning from stage 1 in developing this training. Stage 3, across 12 months, 8 sessions of spiritual direction will be provided to teacher participants across a variety of schools. Teacher participants will be asked to complete a questionnaire prior to participating in spiritual direction, in which qualitative and quantitative data will be collected about their experience of themselves in the role and vocation as teacher. They will be given the same questionnaire at the end of the project. Teacher participants will be interviewed prior to beginning spiritual direction and at the conclusion of the project. Spiritual directors who have been working with the teachers in schools will participate in a focus group at the conclusion of the project. Data collected will be de-identified to ensure participant confidentiality. I want to acknowledge here the generous support of Patrick and Anthony Wright Formation and Education Fund, and also ArtThink, the Australian Research Theology Foundation Incorporated, whose generous support has made this research possible. It means that we can employ several spiritual directors in a variety of schools for stage 3, and we'll be really able to resource them properly. So it's really encouraging to have that support for this research. The methodology that we'll use to collect the data is ethnographic spiritual direction, which I developed in my earlier research. I discovered in the process of my PhD research that researching spiritual experience requires that you have a methodology that intentionally elicits spiritual experience. Ethnographic spiritual direction works actively with research participants in bringing spiritual experience into consciousness through the professionally trained lens of a spiritual director, for the purpose of generating data or analysis. Spiritual direction as a method for ethnographic study is qualitative and is underpinned by 3 essential frameworks, which support a researcher's own spiritual consciousness as the research instrument. The 3 frameworks are the Transforming Experience Framework, which provides a socio-analytic method for listening in an organisational setting, the Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius, which underpin the framework of listening in spiritual direction, and ethnography as spiritual practice, giving the guiding principles of ethnographic research. Ethnographic spiritual direction as a method for gathering research data is a sensory, subjective, culturally specific mode for listening and attending to the somatic, psychological, and metaphysical experiences of both the interviewee and the interviewer as they emerge in the interview and on further reflection after the encounter. Spiritual direction is a living process in which interior movements of the interviewees experienced as either towards or away from source or God or mystery are identified, discerned, and explored. The separation of religion and science has dominated research methods until the late 20th century, when questions began to emerge as to whether mysticism and spirituality could make a unique contribution to scientific inquiry. In 1983, Philip Sherrard argued that science must include an awareness of the sacred, or the outcome would be destructive. Building on Sherrard's argument in 1993, Peter Reason identified the inadequacy of secular science for our times and the need to acknowledge the sacred within ourselves, the world, and the cosmos, stating that sacred human inquiry based on love, beauty, wisdom, and engagement is one of the highest human virtues and possibilities of human consciousness. The notion of a living, sacred cosmos can inform our notions of inquiry so we can develop a new kind of sacred science. In 2011, Yvonne Gruber and Egon Lincoln drew the conclusion that research may be entering into a new age where an emphasis on spirituality will enable greater reflexivity on human flourishing through the integration of the sacred and the secular in ways that promote freedom and self-determination. This new age of research, which integrates and respects spiritual experience within multiple disciplines, calls for new methods of eliciting and analysing data to be developed. Ethnographic spiritual direction is an approach to research that gives particular attention to the potential for human flourishing, using spiritual direction as the primary method of listening. Ethnography being a systemic study of people and cultures, and spiritual direction the method for engaging in that culture. I can't go any further into the details of that methodology as we don't have time, but I have published a paper on that. If anyone's interested, I'd be more than happy to forward it on to you. The project that has currently received ethics clearance from the University of Divinity, but we've been stopped in our tracks due to COVID-19. We intended to travel to Queensland to conduct stage 1 interviews, but that's not possible at the moment. We'll most likely move forward with the intention of conducting interviews online in a few months' time if we can get clearance from Brisbane Catholic Education Office. So the ground has really shifted since COVID-19 has shut us all down, and we're really quite interested in how that will influence the outcomes of our research as well, perhaps even looking at in this climate how spiritual direction can even be more important to the supporting teachers at this time. So that's just a brief overview of the research project. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you, Bernie. It's really interesting. So someone's asked if you would be able to share what you just shared. If you happy to share your notes?
Happy to. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Cool. Great. We will get that. Put somewhere. I wanted to ask you, Bernie, a question. Similar question that I asked Lynette, only because I know that you and I have had this conversation and it's something that you feel particularly passionate about. Spiritual directors as researchers, bringing ourselves not just as the researcher but as a spiritual director in seeking a deeper meaning in the research, in the responses of participants. And I just wondered if you wanted just to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting because I began my research with the methodology of action research, but it wasn't long into the project that I realised that my particular disposition as a spiritual director actually was influencing the way I collected the data, and I couldn't leave that part of me behind. And so I really paid attention to how, like at the end of almost every interview I did, people would say, "Oh gosh, that was so good. I didn't even know that I knew that," or, you know, "Wow, that's so enlightening what we've just unpacked together." So I think that if we can stop feeling like we have to put the spiritual aside while we actually do this research and actually make it a central part of the role, how can you elicit spiritual experience if you're not going to ask questions that take you in a path that's not yet known? I think really that's the bottom line. How can you do that? You really need a method that encourages the spiritual to emerge.
Yeah, absolutely, and not be scared of it. Which
yeah,
often
you just have to declare it. You just have to say somewhere in your thesis that one of the biases or one of the things I'm aware of is, and can remain aware, is that I am a spiritual director, and that will influence the way my data is collected.
Yeah, thanks, Bernie. Little question. A question here about what levels of education are you studying, Bernie? Primary, secondary, TAFE, uni. You were doing
the particular college that we're going to start with is actually a prep to 12 college in Queensland. So that's where we're going to do the initial collection of data to see what is actually happening when is adequate. And I actually have a niece who teaches at the college, and she's been receiving spiritual direction, and she's been saying to me how incredibly helpful it's been for her to have someone to speak about this. When we move into stage 3, we're really open to wherever people will invite us. And we feel that we don't have to limit the number of people we send out or the number of people we see because we've got such a wide range of possibilities. So when we get to that stage, it'll be about whoever invites us in. We haven't really moved to TAFE or uni, though. I think it's mostly just primary and secondary education.
Yeah, it's really exciting project. If there aren't any questions, I would like to very much thank Bernie for sharing that research and that project. It's really exciting to see where spiritual direction is going and making a difference. So
Can I just say, if there's a question about can I have a link to the PhD? At this stage, I can't because it's currently in the process of being published as a book, which should be out in the next few months, I hope. So after that, you will be able to reach the dissertation as well.
But you said you were happy to share your paper on ethnographic
spiritual direction, yes.
We can share that too.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I haven't actually seen Kath, but I am going to now.
I'm definitely here. If I start talking, you might find me. I'm here. Yes.
Wonderful. Hello. So good to see you, Kath.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being part of this symposium. It's delightful to see your face. Kath and I have known each other for a number of years. We've done all sorts of crazy adventures together.
We certainly have. We have stories to share around another bottle of wine one night. Yes.
desert retreats and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So welcome, Kath, welcome. And just want to invite you to share your research journey and what you've been burrowing away and busy doing for the last, what is it, year or so? A couple of years. How long have you been?
Moving towards 3 years, yes. Thank you. Thank you. So what I'm doing is I'm doing a Doctor of Ministry, not a PhD, but a Doctor of Ministry offered by the Global Ministries University, which is based in California. And the way this particular project, the way this doctorate unfolds is there's 4 units and then a research project. I've done the 4 units and I'm doing the research project at the moment and coming to the conclusion of that. And it's that I want to talk about today. And because it's a Doctor of Ministry, they really want to have a very practical application for my work, not just, yes. So I'm going to throw very briefly a few ideas out there that I then had to think, how might I do something with these ideas to place it into some sort of a format that could be available as a practical application. So I want to tell you about Tony. Tony came up to me in the Belgrave Library about 7 years ago now, and he just walks up to me. I hardly know Tony, he's just an acquaintance. He walks up to me and he says, out of the blue, Kath, how do you find hope in a disintegrating world? And I thought, right, well, this is obviously a bit of a spiritual direction question here, and he's not just asking a light question. And we spoke for about an hour together in the library, and that really engaged my interest. How do you find hope in a disintegrating world? So that's one aspect. I want to briefly tell you about Agnes. Now, Agnes doesn't exist. When I was doing one of my units for this doctorate, I did a unit on mysticism, and I was writing a paper on the desert mothers and fathers. And I had this imagining as I was writing that what if a woman who's a desert mother, I've called her Agnes, she's about 23 years old and she's living a life of dedication and prayer out there in the desert. What if one morning she gets up and she wonders what might the future be like in the year 2000, and a place she could never imagine, Australia? What if she somehow prayed forward into the future, that the future would be a place of hope, of health, of spirituality, of connection to the divine? And what if, and this is the thing that really blew me away, what if her prayer landed on me? I'm getting goosebumps as I say it. There's another concept. One more thing to throw into this is Jonas Salk, who invented the polio vaccine, has this saying that says, our greatest responsibility is to be good ancestors. So here we've got Tony saying, how do we find hope in a disintegrating world? We've got Agnes praying forward into me, and this whole concept of praying forward is something that I'm kind of bringing into my research project. What am I going to do about her prayer into me, and me being the greatest responsibility I have is to be a good ancestor? One more thing to throw into all that is the idea that we are very much between stories at the moment. That the stories of a modernist world, let alone a postmodernist world, are just not holding together. We can no longer trust the environment, that it will be the provider of all we need. Certainly in this time of COVID, that's very much up for question. We can't trust the politicians, we can't trust the churches, we can't trust law and order. So we're between stories, and we're trying to find stories that might take us into a future. So with all these different ideas, I'm thinking, how might I come up with a research project that kind of picks up these disparate ideas and turns them into a format that will bring hope through engaging others in the adventure of what I'm calling, or Jürgen Moltmann called it this, the passion for the possible. So the core idea that I want to portray is that hope, how do you find hope in a disintegrating world? That hope is an active concept. That to have hope, we need to have a vision for the future and then work out the steps that we need to put that vision into place to achieve it. And then we need to be setting about implementing those steps. So hope being a very active concept. So my research project is to come up with a handbook. It's called Handbook of Hope, Emerging Stories Beyond a Disintegrating World. And I've intentionally made it a handbook because I want it to be very readable, very approachable. I want it to be intelligent, but not swamped in academic language. And I want it to be aimed at small groups. They might use it as a discussion guide so that people will be engaging, not just reading about it, but actually entering into conversation with what the reading is about. I've chosen 7 different topics. I'll talk about them very briefly in a moment. Ones that have engaged my interest. Look, there are so many topics in our world, obviously, where hope is what we need to find to move forward. But I've chosen topics that really engage my interest because that makes sense. What the handbook presents is a method that can be used in any situation. I've briefly said, here's the issue. What vision do I have about how this issue could be better? What stories currently exist that are looking at a better vision? And let's go on about bringing about that change. So the format of the handbook is that every chapter will have a few summary paragraphs explaining why this area matters. There'll be recent statistics. I've got a bit of philosophy. I'm setting the scene. What I've thought a lot about is who I wanted my audience to be, and part of that is therefore what voice do I want to use? Who am I within this project? Do I want to say that I'm a person of faith? Am I aiming at small faith communities, or am I aiming at groups of no faith? Am I writing something that perhaps everyone in the whole world will engage with? In which case it's far too big and I've sort of lost my voice because I'm having to perhaps water down for the hope of being so inclusive. So I've come up with this, that my voice within it is that I am a person of faith. I'm using that occasionally, but it's definitely not, I'm not hammering that, it just emerges occasionally. It's definitely not a requisite for people engaging with the handbook. There's the underlying feminist methodology, and that's the one I use with my master's, because I want people to be empowered by reading this project. I'm aware as I'm writing it of my leftist, white, feminine, female, middle-class, Christian, Celtic self that is implicit in everything I'm writing about. And certainly the chapters that I've chosen are reflecting that view of myself. So my methodology has arisen from my intention of how the book will be used. As I write, I have been envisioning a group of people sitting around working with this material, and therefore I have come up with the method to engage them to doing so. And the basic philosophy that's sitting behind all of this is the and yet there is always more. What you see now does not have to define the future. So that's the methodology, the basic philosophy that sits behind this whole project. So there are summary paragraphs at each chapter. Then each chapter will have 2 case studies. They're usually Australian, but sometimes they're not. For instance, when I'm looking at the chapter called Healing Hearts, Healing Nations, I'm looking about reconciliation that's come about in Rwanda and in Northern Ireland. So I'm using those as case studies. Each chapter then has a poem, quite intentionally wanting to engage both left brain and right brain in learning, some integrated learning there. One of the things I'm doing at the moment is getting permission to use all these poems, because we can't print a poem in any format without getting permission from the publisher or the poet themselves. There will then be discussion questions for the reader to engage with the topic. And then each chapter has further reading. It's intentionally not an extensive bibliography, just 5 or 6 salient books that are going to be relevant to the topic. Another thing I've done is I've purchased, but not yet used, the website handbookofhope.com. I'm not very skilled at knowing how to set up websites, but others have been giving me lots of ideas. But I'm hoping with handbookofhope.com that people all over the world might start putting up stories of hope that are helping them move into the future. Very much aware that this is something that's needed. The interest in my work has been really humbling. I've already started to do a lot of presentations about this whole concept of hope. It's obviously so topical. I mean, who'd have thought how very topical hope would be with the virus on top of everything else. But my dream is that if there's just a platform out there, handbookofhope.com, that people will be putting their stories in. So when people are feeling less hopeful, they might come across this resource, and just all of the people here might add stories of hope. So that's by the way, that's a further thing. And as I say, it's extraordinary how many people have invited me already through Zoom to be presenting on this topic. So a very, very brief outline of the outline of the book. I've got an introduction where I'm going to pick up this idea of currently living between stories. We need an attitude of creative expectation to be part of the movement of hope. In no particular order, the chapters are going to look at radical simplicity, healing hearts, healing nations, the work that reconnects, and that's the work of Joanna Macy and the Great Turning. Looking at changing agricultural practices, mental health, the divine feminine, and Indigenous stories. That's the one that I've really wanted to know for myself. How are our Indigenous sisters and brothers finding hope, maintaining hope amongst all the things that have happened to them? And so, whereas most of the other chapters I knew quite a bit about, this was very much an exploration for me about where is hope within the Indigenous community, and particularly there I have focused on Australia. And then finally, I've got an epilogue. I'm not calling it a conclusion, I'm calling it an epilogue, because I'm wanting the invitation there to be carrying on the work. And it's within the epilogue that I'll probably talk about Agnes and Jonas Salk and the idea of praying it forward. And I'll probably be bringing up there, if not in the introduction. I've written the chapters, but not the introduction or epilogue. The extra thing that I forgot to mention at the beginning, and that is Rob Bell in his book, What We Talk About When We Talk About God, has this concept that God is with us, for us, and ahead of us. And picking up this idea that God is ahead of us, and wherever we go into the future, there will be hope, because we're coming, and this is where I have to come in as a person of faith. I will be saying there is a God, and this God is ahead of us, so there is hope in the future because God is with us, for us, and ahead of us. And so that will sit in an epilogue. That's it. There you go.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you so much, Kath. That's a really, really exciting project. And I can see that it's enlivened you and given you, life and energy.
I'm thoroughly enjoying it, I've got to say.
Yeah. A couple of comments. People are saying that sounds fabulous and amazing. I feel like we should just pause for a moment and just hold both Kath and Bernie in their endeavours, in their research, in their hope of making the world a better place. I think there are some beautiful parallels between both of those. So let's just take a few moments of just soaking in that. Thank you to Kath and thank you to Bernie.
Kristen, I just realised I never introduced myself.
No, you didn't.
I'm
Let's
sorry.
do that now.
Shall I do that? Shall I? I just realised I'm Kath, and I'm the co-director of the Living Well Centre, which is based here in Melbourne, in a spiritual direction training program. And I'm a little bit of a harpist in the background, as well as doing a few other things in my life. Thank you.
A little bit, only a few CDs. How many CDs, Kath?
Oh, whatever. Yes, several.
I'm wanting to invite you to think about everyone, not just Kath, and everyone who is present. What's touched you? Lynette is still here. In the presentations with Lynette and Bernie and Kath, what's coming up for you? What is exciting you? What is challenging you? And we've got, probably want to keep it to kind of 20, 25 minutes. But I'm just wondering if we can share perhaps any observations, any connections between 1, 2, or 3 of the presentations? Sometimes it's interesting to see how our brains form connections. And just share on the chat. If you're a writer and you've got some pen and paper, you might want to respond in your own way. There's a few comments, so just if you'd like to share anything that came up for you. Oh, Anna's asked if you could put your 7 topics up. So how do you feel about typing those into the chat?
I'm cutting and pasting as we do it.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Liz has said that she's very uplifting to hear about your project, very excited about it, and quite a few people have said that. And I think more than ever, we are reimagining the world, aren't we? You know, we are in between stories, and I think it's the hope that is that bridge between kind of where we've been. And I love that idea of praying forward. It's just beautiful. So Kath has just popped up those 7 topics. Thank you so much. And Carmel's just asked your project on how to Indigenous people keep hope. Okay, so she's from the Philippines, so she has some insights. The other person that you need to connect with on this call is Jane Ormond, because she has got some beautiful connections with Indigenous communities.
Jane, you're wonderful.
Yes. Great. So just any questions for the presenters, anything that's coming up for you? While we're waiting, Kath, let me ask you the question that I asked Lynette and Bernie. What's it like to be a spiritual director and a researcher?
The word privilege jumped into my mind. It certainly, it's giving me a template through which to look at all this work. It's knowing that conversations about the divine really matter, and to be providing a platform, in my case, where that might be the conversation as people sit around the table, that their own faith journeys might have the courage to come forward in those conversations. And because I'm passionate about that happening, I am passionate about that happening because I am a spiritual, well, maybe that's why I'm a spiritual director. So the fact that I'm a spiritual director, although not explicit in this project, is definitely part of the template through which I'm doing the work.
Yeah. I had this funny moment in my research. So I went off looking at 3- and 4-year-olds and their spirituality, and came up with this model of how we encourage young children to go back into experiences and make meaning. And I had this kind of aha moment that the way you do it is spiritual direction. So I kind of didn't take that lens with me, but it came to me. And I thought, oh, all of this, creating safe and nurturing spaces and asking open-ended questions, and you know, and going underneath the things, that's spiritual direction, just in another format.
And that's interesting you say that, because the questions I've got in the questions for discussion part are not just how did you respond to this part, but they are spiritual direction type questions, like about vision and hope and and I, yes, very much aware that they're coming into that part of the paper. Yes.
Yeah, I liked what you said about naming yourself as a Christian woman and white and Celtic and all of those things, because, you know, and I think it's a theme of all 3 presenters, is that we bring our whole selves, don't we? We bring our whole selves, and I think for too long research frameworks have tried to cut the researcher out. They've tried to make it, you know, so that it's very much third person. But how can we help but be part of it, to be changed by, to be transformed by the research?
Yeah. And this became most relevant when I was doing the chapter on the Indigenous sisters and brothers, because I'm having to say I'm not one of you. I'm writing about your experience, talking about they rather than I in this, and being very aware that I am not Indigenous Celt, but not Indigenous Australian. And so myself, I am implicitly part of what I'm writing by trying to remove myself from it, perhaps in that chapter, and saying, let me hear your voices about what you're saying here, because I'm aware my voice, my white woman, middle class, blah, 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 is so dominant in my thinking. Let me hear how you're finding hope.
Yeah. What's your hope for that chapter?
Do you know what? I was recently talking to Safina Stewart, who's an Indigenous artist, and when I was telling her about that chapter, she said, I want every person in the Indigenous community of Australia to read that. I particularly want our people in jail to read it. She said when she goes into jail, into juvenile jail, she said she finds that these are old people because they have lost all hope. And I'm blown away. I mean, that's just so sad. But I'm blown away that Safina thought that there might be some place for this work to be sitting in the Indigenous community, for them to be noticing all these places that they already have hope there.
Wow. Oh, and that beautiful idea of reciprocity, you know, that you get to create something that then, you know, there's a two-way. It's always relational, isn't it?
Isn't it? Yes.
Yeah. So someone wants to know when they can get a copy of your Handbook of Hope, and I'm sure you're working very hard to.
Maybe SDI can publish it. I haven't thought about that side of it yet. I'm just getting this doctorate finished, but I haven't thought about how to publish it yet. But as I say, I'm stunned by the interest in it. I have no idea how to do the next step.
Sometimes it's like you've tapped into a zeitgeist, haven't you? Okay, there's a comment here about quickening. Mary writes, one of my professional roles as a midwife here today, I sense a quickening. A quickening is when a pregnant woman feels the baby in utero for the first time. It can be experienced like a tickly flutter inside your body. New life felt, new life encountered. Beautiful. And I sensed there was something, there was almost a quickening in that conversation with Tony at the library, wasn't there? There was something that flooded in you, that deeper level that said, oh, that's such a good.
I took that question to our next Victorian Spiritual Direction Network, ANSD network, and we were discerning what topic we would pick for the following year. And as I say, this happened about 7 years ago. And we decided that our whole topic for the following year would be how do we find hope in a disintegrating world? And we set about finding 10 different keynote presenters who could come in and talk about hope in their particular field, because it's such an engaging question. How do we find hope in a disintegrating world? Yeah. So it definitely was a quickening. Yes. Thank you, Belgrave Library.
Yeah.
Tony. Thank you, Tony.
Yeah. Jane's offering to help. She's very happy to help you. Okay, so Jane asks a good question about wondering whether the concept of hope is heard in the same way across cultures. And I know Carmel was there from the Philippines, and we've got some people across different cultures here. Singapore, there's quite a few people from Singapore. It's a really good question, isn't it? Is it a universal, innate thing in all of us, or does it look differently? Does it look different across different traditions and cultures? Do you want to speak to that, Kat?
I don't know. I don't know. You've got 70 wise people in the room. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question.
That's a very good question. Yeah. What other wisdom is there on that?
And Kristen, I'm just thinking that spiritual direction is a ministry of hope. You know, I think that's what we're sitting with people, drawing out the hope so that we can enliven the world with some, good energy instead of following the fear and the disintegration. And I just wanted to add that, there's a lot of fear about doing spiritual research in spirituality and spiritual direction. You can't go into a person's personal experience to discover. But my experience of the research is when you go there, people want to go with you, and we can learn a lot more about what we're actually doing if we take this study seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. I've just got a couple of other lovely comments. Ian says, in my experience, finding a new relationship with nature brings people hope. In that Mother Earth can nurture us, heal us, reorient our goals and values. Yes, and I'm sure, Kath, you will find that in the Indigenous.
Yes, I've got a chapter on that when we're talking about why the rise of the divine feminine. The chapter, one of the examples I'm giving is very much the Celtic wise woman. She's called the Bean Feaster, and who's very much connected to Earth, to the seasons, to the cycles. That voice had to find its place somewhere within my handbook.
Of course it did. Of course it did, Kath. Couldn't not. Catherine's got comment here. I'm inspired and excited to hear about the intersections between spiritual direction and other arenas, leadership, corporate, education, etc. I'm a spiritual director and currently training as a coach. My desire is to be a spiritual director in whatever context I am in by listening contemplatively. Yeah, and it comes back to that. We take our whole selves, don't we, out into the world. Sylvia says, I am a chaplain in a children's hospital and women's and newborn hospital in Perth. I struggle with the hope parents cling to when doctors and nurses have given up hope. I'm new in Australia and would appreciate some research on this or books. Okay, so in this collective wisdom, if anyone has anything in that particular arena, hope with newborns in hospital settings, you might like to share that with Sylvia, either here or if people want to pop across to Facebook, if that's something that they like. Dee says she totally agrees with you, Bernie. Terry says, in my experience, I've learnt that I have to bring hope to a situation. When hope is not there, just popped off. Hang on. When hope is not there, it has to be bought. I read a beautiful quote recently by a lady called Anne Van Dam, who's an early educator, gifted early educator. And she says, the power in any room goes to the person who's holding the most hope.
Yeah, nice. This thing about hope and spiritual direction, we're in lockdown here in Melbourne. We're not going anywhere. And so like most of us, all our direction is being done through Zoom. Directee after directee after directee is sitting in front of me on this computer and talking about a hopelessness that has crept into them. And as a spiritual director, I'm very much agreeing that we have to be the hope bearers at this time. Now, where my own hope might come from this is because I too have a spiritual director and go and talk about it there. But I'm very much finding, and I'm sure we're all nodding on this one, that our role at this time is to be the light bearer of hope.
Absolutely.
All the hope for other people.
Yeah, I'm finding my work as a director, I'm working hard to be that beacon of hope.
Yeah.
And particularly, Liz just asked a question about all three presenters from Melbourne, and yes, they are, and that's probably because of my my background in Melbourne, and I know more people in Melbourne. So I very much encourage people from other parts of the country to present. But what I'm hearing just in the last week is since Melbourne's gone to that second lockdown, it's a very different scenario than the first lockdown. Absolutely. There was an article in The Age about we're not making bloody sourdough now, and it just captured that. The first time it was a bit of a novelty, okay, this is new, we can do this. The second time, I mean, I'm not there, but it feels heavy. It feels really heavy talking to Melbourne people. Yeah. Bernie, Lynette, have you got anything to say about what that feels like for you?
I guess I want to offer that every time I speak to anyone in supervision, spiritual direction, like Kath, the first thing we talk about is how are we, and just touch into what we're experiencing, because it has affected people's emotional, psychological, spiritual well-being, you know, very strongly. And in saying that, I think the contact of being a spiritual director and a supervisor has been vital at this time, because it's another person who can hold some of what's they're hearing in a passionate and healing way. So I think that kind of connection is so important at this time. But yeah, it's certainly different, and it's certainly much more restrictive, and you also have to think differently. Every time you go out the front door, you have to say, do I have my mask? I mean, it's just a whole new way of being. On the other hand, I have to say the acts of compassion and the signs of hope are there.
We had a really interesting conversation, Spiritual Direction on the Edge, on Tuesday with spiritual directors. And the topic was, what's happening in COVID-19 for your ministry? And what we really heard was that the ministry is flourishing at this time. It's such an important gift, and people are welcoming the opportunity to share deeply. We've been running retreats online that we're getting people sharing deeper than I've experienced in many retreats I've ever done. So in some ways, I'm seeing a lot of hope, not just hopelessness, but a lot of hope that maybe this is a time when the whole world can reset and rethink the direction that we've been heading. So it kind of depends what you're focusing on, I think. But the other thing I've noticed too is that I don't know whether I'm working or resting or playing, because my whole world seems to have merged into one thing. And I realise it's really quite disconcerting. And I'm wondering if other people have found that kind of thing too, that the boundaries between work and play and whatever are blurred now.
Yeah. 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 Especially when you leave your pajama bottoms on and get on a Zoom call and go off
Your
in the middle of
slippers.
it, get a banana and put a load of washing on and then come back. And yeah. Someone asked who the quote of that hope in the room was. Anne Van Dam. She's an early childhood educator, has a beautiful post. She's very impressive. If she's not a spiritual director, she should be. Mary says, I sense hope is related to how culture relates to the concept of time. Hope for our ancestors, hopeful into future generations, hopeful for today and tomorrow. Oh, that's a really good point about societies that value their ancestors might have different concept of hope. Thanks, Mary. It's a really good quote. It's a really good concept. Liz says, the heaviness forces us to go deeper. What is the underlying hope in a time of uncertainty? Sometimes it can take a while to find. Yeah, sure can. Apparently Virginia Trioli wrote the We're Not Making Bloody Sourdough article, if anyone needs to see that. And Leonie says, holding hope for the other is the core of my work in the clinical mental health setting. So lovely to hear this conversation. Yeah, we're not the only ones being beacons of hope in this by any stretch. I was thinking of you, Bernie, with teachers, holding hope for young people. I've got a 16-year-old on dinner table last night. She said a lot of her friends are they're losing hope, and we know, as older people, we know that it'll pass and this too shall pass and there'll be a time. But when you're younger, you don't have the, that sense of time of things passing. And that was really worrying, that a lot of her friends are really struggling with, where is the hope?
So we have to dream. We have to dream of what we would like a hope-filled world to be about.
Mm. Yeah, and it's they're two parts of the same thing, really, aren't they? The hoping and the dreaming. Do you think?
Yes. Because we can dream of the future, we can set about putting it into place, the action side of it, and that's where the hope is.
Mm. Mm.
Kath, I'm wondering too about the dreaming from the past into the future, that sense of the Indigenous, and the, in the desert mothers and fathers, that sense of the hope that is passed on, or a mantle for us to hold. Mm.
Very powerful, isn't it, Lynn? Very powerful that we're not doing this alone. We are surrounded by ancestors, the communion of saints, those who've gone before us in our own heritage, that they found a way through or not, but that they've got our back.
Mm.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, Kath, that beautiful story you talk about when you present on Celtic women and Hildegard, and when things got a bit hopeless, she just went to bed and cried, and she refused to get out of bed, and there's part of that as well, that sometimes it's okay to feel a bit hopeless. And even though, we're holding that beacon for them, sometimes you've got to go through the darkness of not having hope, of, pulling the covers up.
Yeah, that's our authentic experience, isn't it? We have to bring that to our spiritual direction too. Yeah,
definitely. A few thank yous for today. Stacey says the book of Isaiah has been stalking me through this time. A fascinating look at hope in the midst of trauma. Definitely speaks the hope into reality. Dee says in response to Mary, yes, I work with individuals and artists who help them tell their life stories, say their goodbyes and prepare for the death in a holistic way. A massive part of holding hope is the generations past and future. Hope for in yesterday, today and tomorrow. And we're part of that, aren't we? We are just part of that unfolding story. And like you said, we were saying before, Kath, to be aware of what came before, but also to pray into and be good ancestors.
Yes.
Yeah. And Carol says the privilege of immersing in study with the Coptic Orthodox is absorbing their knowledge and people and times and stories. Prayer one. Yeah, absolutely. I think the Orthodox people have got some beautiful wisdom to share. Well, it feels like a kind of a good place to tie up. I'm so incredibly grateful to all of you who came today, who have an interest in research and how we can take this beautiful gift of spiritual direction into our research and into the world to make it a more transforming and hopeful place. So I want to thank Kath, I want to thank Lynette and thank Bernie. They probably did it as favours to me, but I'm grateful anyway. And each one of you has contributed something so valuable and so inspiring today. So very, very sincere thanks.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. And I look forward to the next one as we continue this conversation. As we mentioned, there's a Facebook page. It's been a bit quiet, but it's just waiting there for comments and people. So if you want to continue any of these conversations, please head across. There'll be some more information coming out about the handbooks and submission guidelines. 3MT, please contact me if you'd like to participate and share your research in the ways that Lynette, Bernie and Kath have. It's not too scary, is it? Hopefully, you know, it's a nice experience and I'm gentle with you all. Yeah, is there anything, Stephen, that you need to add as a final wrap up? The recording will be available for free for in a few days, and we'll make that available to everyone that registered. It's something we want to get out into the world, so you know, obviously with privacy in mind and respect to the presenters. If you'd like to share this with people that you feel would be respectful and in need of this. And goodbye and thank you. Have a wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing what else emerges from this research symposium.